Hi everyone, good afternoon and welcome to the fifth session in the Spring 2024 SunoikisisDC Digital Classics program. This semester is on the topic of digital approaches to cultural heritage. And for this session, we're going to be talking about ethical responsibilities in 3D approaches to cultural heritage. And for the purpose of this, we're going to be focusing on a document, four of the editors of which are with us here. One doesn't currently have the video up, but we have four of us here. This is a white paper which is going to then be a living resource, which is community edited. There are already a dozen contributing authors to it, in addition to the five main editors. Because the white paper aims to raise questions and to encourage sort of thought about and mindfulness about 3D practices, that's the approach we're going to take in this presentation as well. We're not going to attempt to say what are the right or wrong ways to do anything, but we're going to raise a lot of questions to get you thinking about the way you do 3D practice. This semester includes several other sessions on 3D methods and practices. We had a session a couple of weeks ago on 3D imaging, where we had a photogrammetry exercise. We also talked quite a lot about remote sensing. And we will have a session in a couple of weeks on VR, and after that on 3D modeling. All of these are methods that we're addressing today, or that we're hoping the sort of questions that we're raising will address today. So the order in which we're going to do this is I'm going to give a brief introduction to what the white paper is and how it came about, and then each of us will address one of the four main chapters of this white paper, and we'll end with some discussion about where we think this community and this document are going to go next. At all times, we're very happy to receive comments and feedback and questions. So if you're watching this live, hi and welcome, by the way, but if you're watching this live, you can use the live chat feature, which is to the right or beneath the YouTube video, to post questions. And if you're watching live, please do use the chat feature now. Just tell us who you are and where you're watching from. We like to know who's with us. And you can also follow along in two ways. There's a link beneath the YouTube video. I'm also putting it on the screen now, but there's a link beneath the video in the description of the video, which you can click on. So it's a lot more convenient than the one on the screen, which has all of the materials for this session in. And most importantly, among those, we have the slides as a PDF. So you can access those. You can click on the links in the slides and look at them at your own time. And there is also a link to the sort of zeroth draft, the pre-first draft of the white paper that we're describing today. And there's a link to that under required readings, because those of us who are using this in our teaching are using that white paper as the reading to discuss with students in our classes following this. So yes, as I say, we're very happy to see discussion and feedback in all sorts of contexts. So yes, so for the moment, I'll start just by saying a little bit about where this white paper comes from. We started thinking about this, or several of us started thinking about this, because we were involved in 3D practices of one kind or another, and they were all quite different kinds of 3D practice, and that we were coming to in different ways. Some of us were practitioners, some of us were primarily teachers, some of us were thinking about the legal and ethical implications behind these things. Some of us are consumers of 3D data and material. Some of us were critiquing consumption of publicly available 3D material. And we were really thinking very much collectively about what are the sorts of questions that we should be asking ourselves, and that we hope other people doing 3D practice would be asking themselves, and whether there was a market, as it were, for these sorts of materials to encourage practitioners, especially in the GLAM sector, in the cultural heritage sector, but also researchers working with cultural heritage, to stop and ask themselves a question, the question that Jurassic Park warns us to ask, that not only what can we do with all this amazing technology? And to be clear, we do think this technology is amazing and has lots of value. And there's all sorts of really exciting things that come as a result of using these technologies for cultural heritage. But also, should we be doing all of these things? And are there questions we should be asking ourselves? Should we be slowing down? Should we be in any way just sort of backing up a little bit and just being sort of more careful, more mindful, and more thoughtful in the way we do this. So we had two conversations about this over the last couple of years. The first, in November 2022, we had an online seminar which lasted a little over an hour, where we had 4 case studies presented by 4 of our collaborators, all of whom are also contributors to this document and this community, and then some discussion about what were the ethical questions that were raised by the discussions that they were having. And this was an online seminar hosted by the Digital Humanities Research Hub at the University of London, but which we all co-organised. And then this was followed up a few months later in May 2023 by a 2-day workshop event, of which the first day was an open workshop, which had a couple of dozen people in person and maybe another 50 or so online, discussing some of these issues in more detail. So not via case studies, but really via questions, via problems, and really sort of open-endedly, what are the big questions that we want to address, or that we really hope people doing 3D digitization or 3D modeling or 3D presentation or printing of heritage would think about and would ask themselves before moving forward. Followed then by a day of with a smaller group, to which anyone was welcome, but in practice it was a much smaller group. Really sort of setting the agenda for what would a document helping to raise some of these questions look like. And what we came up with coming out of this, and the first draft of this is, as I say, is linked in the session page that you can find beneath the YouTube video. What we came up with was a document of which this is effectively the table of contents, right? So we have a preface explaining what the document is, which is doing much what I'm doing now. We then have sections discussing Indigenous community knowledge, IP and equitable access, disability accessibility, environmental impact and sustainability, and then there are some other parts to this. There's a bit of glossary. There's some discussion of how the community around this living document will continue to work with and edit and author this document, because I think we all agreed that a static printed or PDF document produced in 2024, giving guidance and advice and raising questions about 3D would very quickly cease to be useful, to be current. Each of these 4 main chapters, then the subject areas, have well, there's 2 important things to note about them. One is that they are in some ways a slightly artificial distinction between different approaches to the ethics of 3D practice in cultural heritage, because there's so much overlap and bleed through between them. It was probably useful still to have them in separate chapters, but there are all sorts of questions, all sorts of resources that we might want to include in more than one of these chapters. And so that's the first thing to bear in mind, that there are, for example, many of the questions of environmental impact and sustainability are particularly important when we're talking about Indigenous and community heritage. Issues of IP and equitable access obviously impact a lot on Indigenous heritage, impact a lot on disability, and so forth. So there's crossovers in a million places within this document. The other thing to note that arises again in all four of these chapters is the concept of nothing about us without us, right? A lot of if we're talking about community, especially if we're talking about Indigenous and community heritage, and if we're talking about disability accessibility, we shouldn't, as outsiders to those communities, be trying to answer those questions. Just as among the advice we're hoping that will make people more thoughtful about is that you wouldn't be digitizing Indigenous heritage, or you wouldn't be attempting to cater to elements of the disabled community with certain kinds of 3D technologies without the not only involvement but leadership of those communities themselves. And the same applies to us as people putting together this white paper and these thoughts. So that's part of the reason why we want to have such a large community around this, because no matter who we had involved as the 4 or 5 editors of this, we wouldn't be able to cover every single community possibly impacted by this in any case. So we need to have this massive community involved in this at all times. And we'll come back to both of those things throughout this document. Final thing I just want to say is that each chapter then has the following structure. We have some introduction, some definitions. We follow this with a series of questions that we hope the people digitizing these resources or producing these 3D resources will ask themselves while planning and engaging and disseminating their work. These are not commandments. We're not claiming to have the answers, but we hope these are questions which will help people to come up with better practice. We then have some general resources to help people come up with better practices in these areas, and also some specific studies, some specific examples of good practice, and so forth. So these are the structure of each chapter. This document isn't, as I say, a Bible for good practice. It's very much raising a bunch of questions that we hope will make us all more mindful as we do practice our 3D work in these areas. And I think, yes, that's all I was going to say by way of introduction. Each of those 4 chapters then is going to be introduced by a different one of us, and first up is going to be Paula Granados García, who's at the Endangered Material Knowledge Program at the British Museum, is going to talk about the first chapter on Indigenous and community knowledges, heritage and data. Please go ahead, Paula.
Yes, hello everybody. Thank you, Gabby. So as Gabby said, I'm Paula Granados García, and I'm the digital curator and operations manager of the Endangered Material Knowledge Program. And we as a program, we work with communities and researchers across the world to document material knowledge practices that are in danger of disappearing because of different reasons, from climate change to globalization. And the goal of the program is to digitally preserve these material practices and this knowledge in an open access repository for future generations to learn and share. And so from the very beginning, I was very interested in this project because every day we get more and more requests from communities and researchers that are interested in using 3D technologies and 3D methods to document the tangible aspect of the material practices that they are interested in. So I was very keen to delve into the ethical approaches towards the 3D methods with the idea to kind of like guide and help these teams and communities to have ethical considerations before and during any 3D projects that they wanted to carry out. So the section of Indigenous community knowledge, I think, We can move to the slides now. Yeah, great. So this section of Indigenous community knowledge is perhaps one of the most complex sections, at least for me, because it's one of the hardest to delimit, in the sense that we don't want to focus only on Indigenous peoples, but also communities more broadly and traditional knowledge holders. At the same time, in some cases, communities may be seen as a sort of solid group that only has one opinion, but that's not the case in many situations where there are different opinions in one same community, different perspectives and multivocality, and we therefore need to make sure that we can address all these different voices and not a single one. Of course, the section also depends on context, because it's not the same approach towards Indigenous data in Africa as in Aboriginal Australia, so it can vary a lot. And it engages, this section engages with all the other 4 sections, as Gabi has said, and it has an impact in the whole data cycle, so acquisition, processing, use, and publication. And of course, I also wanted to say that none of us here today are Indigenous, but we have had direct Indigenous input into the project, into the generation of the white paper, and we hope to keep having it in the future. As Gabi said, this is a live resource, and we hope to keep collecting feedback from the community. So I wanted to start with a quick definition, and there are many definitions that we could use in this section, and some of them have been listed in the resources list, but I wanted to use this one because it refers to the idea of traditional knowledge. So as you can read in the slides, traditional knowledge refers to the knowledge, practices, and behaviors of Indigenous and local communities all around the world. It is passed from generation to generation, both orally and through practice. And I wanted to use this particular definition because to me, the digitization of an object is not only the digitization of the object itself and its tangible kind of aspect, its tangible side, but it's also the digitization of all the knowledge that has been put into the production of that object, and also the meanings that that object carries, the uses, and the knowledge systems in which this object is embedded. So I think that this definition is quite interesting in this sense. So, as we know, in the past, the use of technology to document Indigenous and community knowledges has failed to recognize the rights, expertise, and diversity of communities of origin and knowledge holders, and it has also, in some circumstances, neglected Indigenous peoples and knowledge holders the access and rights to share and benefit from the outputs of the application of this technology. Therefore, in this section, we bring up questions and considerations that we think are key for the responsible development of any project that involves 3D technologies and Indigenous and community knowledges. So the main question here would be, what decisions can we make before, during, and after using 3D methods to address these imbalances? So, like Gabi said, with this famous Jurassic Park citation that I love, the famous quote, ethics is what comes between what we can do and what we must do, what we should actually do. It's not always that because we can do something that we should do it. So the guiding questions for this section that are then developed further into the different subsections within this section are: who are we doing this for? Do we have permission? Is the community involved? What are the benefits? What is the impact? Who is the author or the creator? And how will it be shared? So one of the first questions that came up when we were planning this section was the order in which we were going to present the recommendations for this section. And after some deliberations and ideas, we agreed to follow the current principles structure, since we thought that they have been precisely developed to make sure that projects including Indigenous data engage with Indigenous people's rights and interests. And so, as you may know, FAIR principles were developed in 2016 to provide guidelines on making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And they stem from the open access movement, with the idea that all data should have minimal access restrictions. The particular emphasis of FAIR principles is on increasing the capacity of computer systems to find and reuse data, as humans rely more and more on devices to help us navigate through the increasing volume and complexity of information. So we all agree that FAIR principles are amazing and they have been really useful in making research available for everybody. However, they do not always engage with Indigenous people rights and interests and follow, and they tend to, well, no, they were made to always follow the premise that all data should be open, which in some cases may not be the best decision for Indigenous groups that may want to protect their knowledge for specific reasons. So there are groups that have different perspectives on access and preservation that can be defined by the nature of the sensitivity of the material that is preserved, or the rights of the knowledge holders, or the type of materials that we are preserving, for example, human remains or archives that collect images of deceased peoples, or videos or rituals that are sacred to the community. So there are many different collections that have many different sensitivities that need to be acknowledged and taken care of. And this is something that we have seen more and more when communities across the world have to face this dichotomy where they have this desire to protect and digitally preserve their knowledge, but they not necessarily want to open it to everybody, and they shouldn't. So in this sense, the CARE principles were developed to enhance the data-centric perspective of FAIR and add this kind of ethical responsibility dimension to the processing of the information. And I encourage you to have a look at these principles and the recommendations and use them as a reference in your research. And they are also linked in the resource, so you will be able to have a look. So, so as you can see, you were able to see in the slide before, the first principle is collective benefit. And so the questions that there are several questions in this section, but some of the main questions here are: whose heritage? So what is the community of origin of the heritage that we are going to document? Are we involving them in the process? Do we have their consent? Will they be present when this documentation is done? Then who is making the decisions? This is also linked to the next section, which is focusing on making decisions and power. We will see that. So who gets to decide what to document and why? Who is leading the process? So this doesn't mean that it has to be a person only or a community only. It can be a collaborative process. And that's, in many cases, that's the best approach. To what extent are the original or local community or knowledge holders involved or in the process? Who will benefit from this? Who will take long ownership? And how will you enable, or how are we going to enable multiple voices to be reflected in the creation and presentation of 3D models of heritage? Second question, as I was saying, is about control, authority to control. And control in many cases is related to consent. So are we sure that we have the consent from the community to develop this digitization, to carry out this project? Who is taking the lead and who is giving us this permission? Is the whole community? Are there different perspectives within the community? Are we making sure not to cause conflict in the community because of proposing this new idea? Like we said before, like who is the request to digitize coming from? Who are you planning to involve and consult with? How will you ensure long-term control once the materials have been published and released? And this is a very, very big question in digital archiving, because I understand archives are something alive, something that keeps or has to be developed further, keeps alive, it's a work in progress, right? Archives are never completely finished. And so how are you going to make sure that this community decision power is going to stay after the materials are published? And also, if you're considering publishing results in open access, how are you communicating the implications of open access to your participants, right? And then I just wanted to mention quickly this final section on, well, there are two more sections within the care principles that deal with responsibility and ethics. And I wanted to have them at the end and together because they are kind of like related to everything else. So they are two whole sections in the care principles, but they are related to all the rest of the sections in this paper as well. And I wanted to have the data cycle here because it's like all goes back to the beginning. It's like all connected, and they all these two last questions are related to the idea of relationships and safeguarding mostly. So how are you going to ensure the development of positive relationship with the knowledge holders, grounded in respect, reciprocity, mutual understanding, and especially defined by the communities of origin? Yeah, so that's the section. That's a little summary of the section of Indigenous rights and ethics about data. And like Gabby said, the idea was to give recommendations and questions in this sort of dynamic of asking yourself these questions at the time of carrying out a project like this. So that's everything from me, Gabby.
Great, thanks very much, Paula. The third section then is, sorry, the second section, which Tala is going to talk to us about. Tala Rahal is a research associate at the GLAM-E lab at the School of Law in the University of Exeter. Is the section, she's going to talk to us about the section on intellectual property and equitable access.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, yeah.
Okay, great. So hello, everyone. I'm here to talk about the, I'm here to talk about the intellectual property section here. So with the digitization of cultural heritage, it has become more and more present within cultural institutions who are creating digital surrogates of their collections. And with the development of 3D technologies, IP law has been at the forefront of discussions regarding potential issues that may arise. And those issues and those questions arise mainly concerning copyright law, data ownership, the attribution of IP rights, the usage of open licenses, and much more. So this section of IP, like the rest of the sections and chapters that we will be talking about, seeks to outline some of the key questions to think about. It doesn't provide answers, but poses those questions to think about with the aim to reach equitable access. So we're going to start generally with what is copyright. So copyright arises automatically in any original content that anyone creates, like text, visual works, sound recordings, etc. The term of protection typically lasts for the author's lifetime plus 70 years after their death, but this also depends on the jurisdiction. Copyright may be held by more than one party. It could be transferred to another party or waived. A right holder is entitled to a monopoly during the term of copyright and can leverage access for fees. The public may access the work via exceptions and limitations in national copyright law. And as mentioned, copyright law is territorial. That's an important point, but it has been gradually harmonized over the years by international conventions. And copyright is also accompanied by moral rights, like the right of attribution and the right of integrity. It's always best to assume that a work is in copyright unless there's evidence that confirms otherwise. Other rights could also arise, like performers' rights, database rights, contractual rights, privacy, data protection, etc. So why copyright is important, especially with 3D technologies? Copyright comes with layers of complexities to look through. First of all, we have to look at whether what is being digitized and made into a 3D copy is something that meets the threshold of originality for copyright. Once once we go through that, then as mentioned, copyright is territorial. So we have to think about jurisdiction and location of where the object is from, or where the object is being digitized from or being 3D scanned from. And after that, we have to think about moral rights that could be attached to a work, which also depend on jurisdiction. It's important to think about how copyright law differs from country to country, as how IP law is applied will affect what copyright is being claimed in the digital work. And nowadays, we're seeing cultural institutions are taking a more open access approach. While this is great, it is important to note, however, that when digital copies are open access and or open license, everything is out in the open. Anyone is able to use these copies. Materials can be used by anyone, which exposes them to new forms of knowledge extraction. So here we see that there is an imbalance of uses. So yeah, we have an imbalance of uses. Yes, open access and making things available online is great, but at the same time, these digitization and open access efforts might not fit with the originating community's relationship with their own cultural heritage or idea of how they should be handled. Consequently, through that, we can see issues arising around privacy, sensitivity, as well as questions on what type of material may be appropriate to put online. In that sense, maybe taking a slow digitization approach could be more ideal. It is more of a critical approach that examines the process of digitization instead of just immediately mass digitizing everything. It's taking a step back and asking oneself questions. And so the main question really with IP that governs everything is, who owns the data created by 3D technologies? And so here are a few guiding questions that through working on the white paper and through having discussions with various people, these are a few questions that have come up. Here they're separated into 3 main areas, but there's much more. So this is more of a general overview. But we have questions related to copyright ownership. It's good to think about who owns the data and the digital 3D copies of cultural objects, who gets to decide on the ownership of the data. Are Indigenous communities involved in projects concerning their own culture? And with open licensing tools and solutions as well, it's important to think whether or not consent will be taken from the originating community, what is being done with licensing to help ensure fair use, what type of licenses will be used, thinking of who has control over these licenses. We also have questions related to contracts and policies generally, of whether or not licensing agreements will be implemented, how they will be structured, will restrictions be implemented, if the terms and conditions applied will be applied for models available for download. There are also questions arising when it comes to perhaps end user license agreements, when it comes to software, whether these agreements will be affecting mine or others' rights, whether or not certain softwares are governed by specific laws and jurisdictions, et cetera, et cetera. There's much more, but it is important to think about these questions. So I will give 2 examples of 2 projects, just to give an idea of how one can approach 3D digitization. So here we have the Nefertiti hack. So here 2 artists allegedly scanned the Nefertiti bust with a Kinect Xbox camera under their jacket, and they circled the Nefertiti in the museum. They then released a 3D scan of it online. But the scan was of such high quality that there was absolutely no way that the artist could have had such results with only a Kinect. What the artist said is that the data they collected through the scans was handed to a data processor, which then gave them the end result that we have here. And they said this is what they got back. But here we have questions and issues. So this is a great example about issues related on how the data was obtained. It's very unclear. We have a huge question and issue of provenance. And so regardless of how or what they did, it's basically it seems that it's a museum model that was released, and we don't really know how this was done, but as the museum scans are in copyright, but here it was questioned whether or not the artists were somehow able to acquire the museum's own scans. But everything around this project is not very clear. So this is an example of not knowing where the data has come from. And then here we have the example of the Eguthi Works Camp. So here we see a 3D model of the Eguthi Work Camp in Nyeri, Kenya, which today has been converted into a high school. So this project was led by Chautayana Maina, who had a mission to use technology to unearth hidden or suppressed history and its injustices, and making it accessible to a wider audience. And since 2019, Tayana has been working in collaboration with volunteers and colleagues in Kenya and the UK to document and digitally reconstruct and curate an exhibition that sheds light on the work camps that were built by the British in the early 1950s. So this is a great example of a community-led project. And so just to conclude, as we've said, we posed a lot of guiding questions that one should ask themselves before starting a project. And of course, there are more and more questions that arise, especially with AI becoming increasingly discussed. And as we are seeing ChatGPT or AI art generators, we are also seeing a rise, and we're already seeing AI 3D model generators, which bring an even wider set of questions and more complex legal issues, especially in IP. So yeah, that will be the end for me.
Great, thank you, Tala. And the third section, Andrea is going to talk to us about. Andrea Wallace, who is also in the School of Law at the University of Exeter. And
great.
Yes,
there we go.
Talk to us about the disability accessibility chapter. Thank you, Andrea.
Right. So when we talk about disability accessibility, it's really important to think first and foremost, like, what are the questions that we think are most important, or the goals that we have in mind when we're looking at disability projects. But because disability accessibility, usually we just hear accessibility as kind of the term that's used, right? Accessibility is also often used as an umbrella term for a lot of other things. So I'm going to kind of talk about that, but about how centering disability when we're asking even questions about digital accessibility can really help us think about more accessible and meaningful projects overall. So next slide. So what is disability accessibility? It's an important subset of accessibility, as I just said, but it's also a really important lens through which we can view other questions related to accessibility. So this might be related to digital devices, access to the internet, tech interface, even physical access when we're thinking about collections themselves and the ability to reproduce collections for disability accessibility. Because as we design different technologies and also different ways to access collections, those interfaces themselves need to be accessible for disabled audiences. It's also something that's required by law. So in the UK, we have the Equality Act 2010, and of course, it requires access and also the provision of reasonable accommodations for different organizations, businesses, institutions, public bodies. And so it's an important concept that we need to build into all operations and all decisions that we're making all the time. But it's also a type of access that can sit in tension with intellectual property rights. So if you think about some of the issues that were discussed previously, we will have large sets of works that are in the public domain. There's no rights in them. So it's actually very easy to create copies or digital surrogates of them. At the same time, we're going to have a lot of materials that are in copyright. So different artworks that we would need a copyright exception or permission of the copyright holder in order to create a 3D version for disability access, right? And so we do have an international treaty that is all about facilitating access to copyright protected works. But it is narrow in that it's about visual impairments or partial and blind persons, and also a narrow set of subject matter. So it refers to print disabled. So in the most narrow sense, we're thinking about Braille, we're thinking about audiobooks, we're also thinking about large format text, and those being things that actually need a copyright exception in order to allow people who need those sorts of accommodations to read, to enjoy heritage, and to be able to participate in culture. So what the treaty does is it allows certain public bodies to make accessible format copies. So we have a limitation on who is able to create an accessible format copy, but there's also a very narrow understanding of what accessible format copy can be. And so if we're thinking about print works, then again, we have very specific formats. But if we're thinking about culture in general, and even taking 2D works, artworks, and converting them to accessible format copies, we then start to have a lot of other decisions enter the field that help us start to kind of question our own assumptions about what's important to create an accessible format copy of, who should be involved, whether the accessible format copy itself should get intellectual property protections, and what the impact of those rights are when they're enforced. We do have some national implementations of the Marrakesh Treaty that have been extended beyond print disability. And so these are looking at other types of creative works and creating copyright exceptions for them. But again, we do have a lot of collections that are not protected by copyright. As we say, those are in the public domain. And so there may not be any intellectual property issues when we're thinking about creating an accessible format copy. So some of the guiding questions that we have in the white paper are trying to get people thinking about 3D specifically, the reproduction of 3D and what that means fundamentally, right? What does 3D add? What are its limitations? What might it take away? And I think it's really important to also acknowledge the abled assumptions that are embedded when we're talking about access to culture and our ability to consume and engage with culture. There is an assumption that, and especially in copyright, when you can't make a copy of something, that visual engagement, right, is required or necessary in order to appreciate the work. Okay, we have all kinds of different sensory experiences that we might bring into the fold when we're trying to think about what 3D can add or take away, but quite often we see more of a literal sense or understanding of what that translation is, okay? So then that kind of relates to this question of how accessible are 3D projects for disability accessibility? Because when we see projects that are, printed and then displayed at the institution or, the specific exhibition, we still require people to travel to those exhibitions in order to appreciate them. So what might be some of the opportunities that digital facilitates around disability access that doesn't still base or ground those assumptions in the need to have physical access? That also kind of makes us think, who should be involved in these projects? Who should be leading them, right? Who should even be proposing them to cultural institutions? Who has access to funding to be able to propose these types of projects? Because how they proceed and the lessons learned from them will create more inclusive spaces for everyone and for all kinds of disabilities. So not just visual disabilities, print disabilities, physical disabilities, sensory, learning. And this is where we start to think about how we can center disability in a way that produces all kinds of benefits for lots and lots of people, not just people with disabilities, but even carers, people who are of low socioeconomic income and might not be able to travel. So this kind of approach to really teasing out the layers of disability accessibility does result in benefits for a greater amount of people. And this is where we start to think about, how 3D can be optimized and differentiated, because in the process, we're going to be taking a work and translating it to an accessible format copy, which means quite often there's sufficient transformation for that work that's produced to be sufficiently original under copyright law, and for people to want to claim copyright in that because they think there's a potential to license that work to other exhibitions, to people who may want their own copy. And so I'm going to give you a few examples of that and where those tensions come through as well. And then lastly, what about copyright in the new accessible format copies? As I said, we have some exceptions to copyright, and we also have legal obligations under the Equality Act. Will those same exceptions apply to the new accessible format copies? It's a very interesting question to consider. So a few case studies. One is Feeling Van Gogh, which was a project at the Van Gogh Museum, Amsterdam. And what they essentially did is they worked with Fujifilm to develop this really innovative technology that scanned a work and then 3D printed it in incredible detail, almost one for one. So the painting itself then was a 3D version of Van Gogh's work, an exact copy, and it was available for partially sighted and blind visitors to come and feel and engage with. And there were other aspects, of this specific project. They created replicas of some of the paintings, like an actual 3D, and had opportunities for advanced bookings, for guided tours. They were €120, and carers got in for free, but the disabled visitors had to pay the €19 fee at the door. So we also start to see some socioeconomic issues in terms of accessibility to disability projects, right? Now, you may be thinking, wow, 3D prints of these paintings, amazing. So they also created limited editions of these replicas. I think there were 9, and sold them for €22,000 when they were first launched. You could purchase them in the gift shop, and had traveling exhibitions around the United States in malls and other shopping centers that were pop-up Van Gogh museums. So a lot of institutions, of course, are cash strapped and trying to think creatively about how they can commercialize certain things. And in the process, there may be some benefits or different opportunities to serve multiple audiences. But this idea of exclusivity and also the retention of the copyright, or the average person's inability to do this type of project, will create different barriers in the process. So some of these questions are really important to think about and build into the business case and the perspective of the institution and why they're doing the things that they're doing. So another example, touching masterpieces, this is a different type of 3D technology that was used to create these kind of invisible models that when you put the gloves on, they connected to a computer that sent haptic signals into the gloves so that the visitors could actually feel what the sculpture would have felt like. So of course, some of the really well-known pieces that were selected, the Venus de Milo, there are many others that I'm sure you would recognize right off the bat, were included in this exhibition. And something that's interesting about this is, again, this kind of like high-tech solution to creating access, which is really kind of cool and neat, but at the same time, how many people would be able to replicate this process with the data that's produced, right? Because you had to have the computer, the data, the gloves, all of these things, which amounted to thousands of euros in the process. But there's also some really interesting curatorial decisions that were made in terms of which objects were selected. So in this image, when you watch the video, you can see the person kind of interacting with the Venus de Milo, and he says, wait, where are its arms? You know, and so something that is so incredibly interesting and important to vis-abled audiences becomes like a quirk, or wait, why, you know, for audiences who may not have literally seen that kind of stereotype, and also the reason why the Venus de Milo has all of this, you know, mystery around her. So something that's interesting for us to consider is why we pick the pieces that we pick, right? What are we choosing to replicate in the process when we decide what types of works are most important to create accessible copies of, and to extend access to, and how? And then lastly, this was a funded project that took place here in the UK, where so it's called Arches. They actually engaged visual learning disabled and other disabled researchers and people and volunteer groups in the process of designing a multi-sensory kind of way to engage with these paintings. So when you would go into a gallery, you would see the painting on the wall, and this kind of display was in the front, and you'll see that there's a bit of a raised kind of replication of the painting, but through the technology, because there was a camera that came down, as the person would touch different things, there would be different aspects that were conveyed to the person who was engaging with the work, right? We also have Braille on this side, so they're not only considering print disabled, but also learning disabilities and other sorts of ways to deliver and engage people in terms of the information and how they're appreciating it. You'll also notice that the video online for this project has someone doing sign language in the bottom, right? So even the delivery methods of this project thought about the audiences and the ways in which they could build accessibility into every aspect of the project and the information delivery. Lastly, there is a lot to be said about small digitization projects that can contribute to bigger accessibility projects, whether that's in 2D or 3D. So this open source software called Coyote is an image description software that allows different workflow models and people to create accounts and then actually give descriptions to images. So MCA Chicago and Sina Baram at Prime Access Consulting collaborated on this project, and it sits alongside the digital asset management system interface and creates the alt text for all of the images. So images for the online gift shop, as well as different artworks. But they are experimenting with, you know, not only these just kind of descriptive alt text, but also alt text that could kind of convey the meaning of the artwork, or that was delivered through poetry. And so they did different types of workshops around how to kind of explore what different types of descriptions could be, but it also facilitates descriptions in different languages, and it attaches to the metadata. So when you download an image, that's in there, and there is even a statement for the specific alt text that's in the image. So you could say, this is CC0, please use it, right? So we've got some really interesting kind of projects that are looking at disability and access from different perspectives that allow us to take different, you know, takeaways from different projects and maybe bring them together to think about disability access as a whole. And so this is, you know, where we come to some of the questions that we're looking at in the paper and where we're going to be collecting more resources. What does a more holistic understanding of accessibility look like when we actually center disability in that, right? Whose voices are represented or even leading when designing digital projects, policies, and programming? You know, what types of projects will reach the widest audiences for disability access? Are they 3D projects? or do they even enable 3D projects by disabled audiences and people themselves, right? So to that extent, the movement to publish images in open access, the fact that the image is available, that this data is available, creates a way in which people do not have to seek copyright permissions from the institution who's created the digital surrogate in order to create their own accessible format copy, right? Then we're thinking, what alternative uses, marginalized voices, and more transparent innovations for disability access can even help us think access, copyright, and digital media accessibility as a whole. And how might copyright and commercialization desires inhibit some of these mission critical and open access activities that we see for disabled audiences? And this is where, Open Glam itself, which is galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, could really account for disability accessibility as a core tenet and really promote and help surface disability accessibility in ways that, as I mentioned at the beginning, obviously benefit different types of disabilities, but also people who have other demands on them that may not identify as disabled. And that includes people who haven't been diagnosed, right? So the question then becomes, how does centering disability improve accessibility for all constituent groups? And what sorts of examples are out there that we can use, even to take different lessons from when we're starting to think about how to do more inclusive and more holistic disability accessibility projects going forward.
Thank you, Andrea. It's fantastic. So for the fourth section and final section that we have is on environmental impact and sustainability, and I will quickly talk through some of the key elements of this chapter. I should so firstly I will sort of race through this quite quickly because although we're starting to run slightly short of time, everybody kept exactly to time except that my introduction was too long, so I'll make up for it by making this part shorter. On the four sections on this, and I'm sharing the wrong screen, hang on, there we go. The four sections of this chapter, 5 sections of this chapter, the 5 headings that we've collected the questions under are hardware, software, sustainability and data formats, storage options, data centers, etc., and disposal or recycling. And before I go into these, I want to just point out that the vast amount of work on this chapter of the document was carried out by our colleague and co-editor Dipali Mathur, who is a researcher at Ulster University and is an expert in e-waste, among many other things. Just to sort of very quickly talk through these the five headings for when you're thinking about hardware, and this is one of these elements that you're going to really want to think about before you start your project, right? I mean, you can't start thinking about the environmental impact of your project when you've already done most of the work, because some of the decisions, such as what hardware you're going to buy, you have to not only make at the beginning of the project, but even before, when you're thinking about costing the project, applying for funding, all of these sorts of questions. And you're going to want to balance the cost of the hardware with the environmental impact of the hardware, the materials that it's made from, its power usage, how far it has to travel if you find a really good and really cost-effective 3D printer, for example, that has to be shipped from several thousand miles away. That has to factor into your cost, right? You'll also want to think about the sort of number of copies of things you're going to need to make, whether these things are both cost-effective and how much waste that produces. So if you're 3D printing something, each object that you print, even if that object is going to be reused again and again and again and is fairly sustainable in its own right, each object will also produce a certain amount of waste filament in the form of supports and bases and other aspects of the printing process. So all of these questions about how long your hardware is going to last, how much you actually need, how much you really need the highest end software, and so forth, all factor into the sustainability decisions you're making in the process of planning your 3D work. The second heading is software, and software again has a cost impact associated with it, but also then has a computing power process which factors into what hardware you need to buy, into how much electricity is used in the process of running this software, how long these things take, and there may well be other ethical implications involved in where and by whom the software was created, and who profits from it, and so forth. This is one point at which you're going to want to think about whether is doing the best and most high-powered and most detailed and processor-intensive and expensive version of this 3D processing really necessary, or could I do something that is less polluting, less power hungry, that will still be perfectly good for my purposes? And this is thinking that this is something that is being thought about across digital humanities and computing, generally with movements like minimal computing and so forth, where you can think about, is it just as good to produce something that's slightly lower tech that produces much less pollution and power usage and so forth. Related to this are questions of data formats. You need to think of a data format that is sufficiently high standard to ensure sustainability, which also, which one of the impacts of which is that it reduces the need to redo the work again and again every few years as standards change. But also, do you really need the highest scale of work and so forth? Thinking about data dissemination and data preservation impacts on questions that we've heard in several of the previous sections. The care principles, collective benefit, authority, responsibility, ethics, in particular environmental justice, and so forth. And if you're thinking about materials related to this sustainability and format question, if you're 3D printing as part of your 3D practice, how sustainable are these 3D printed objects? Are you using more or less polluting materials? Are you using materials that are going to last a longer time, both in terms of their general biodegradability, but also in terms of their robustness against breakage, and so forth? These are all things that you might want to factor into your environmental footprint alongside the cost of your project. Storage, then, this question of data centers. Data centers are famously extremely power hungry, extremely polluting. Data centers are very often located in less developed parts of the world and use vast amounts of water for cooling, vast amounts of electricity. They can often lead to power shortages and indeed water shortages in the areas where they're based. So you might want to think in terms of how much material do you need to put in the cloud? Could you balance with local storage? Are there local alternatives to offsite storage other than the large multinational owned cloud services, and other factors to mitigate some of these costs and harms? And finally, if we're talking about disposal of hardware and other materials at the end of a project. This again leads into what hardware you've chosen to purchase. Have you bought hardware that's really only going to last the length of your project and then is going to need to be disposed of? Are you talking about hardware that can be resold, can be repurposed? This links in with some of the questions raised in the first section on Indigenous and community heritage. Who is going to benefit from the expenditure that you've made? Who's going to get to keep this hardware at the end of the process? Can someone benefit from it? Are you producing landfill waste? Are you going to be disposing of obsolete components, which are then going to lead to pollution leaching into the ground from the wastage? In particular, which isn't likely to happen, locally in rich and well-funded countries and cities. It's more likely to be exported to poorer parts of the world to recycle, or in some cases to sort of semi-recycle and otherwise just allow to rot in landfill. How many of the materials you're producing are actually recyclable or upcyclable that don't have to be disposed of cheaply? And again, if we're thinking about 3D printing, do 3D recycled 3D filament actually end up being recycled, or like a lot of so-called recycled plastic, do they just end up being shipped to other parts of the world where they're out of sight and out of mind? These are all things that you can look into, and again, as with all of the other sections, are we thinking? Are you thinking only about what your legal obligations are, or also about other ethical costs and benefits that you can factor into these decisions? So there's a lot of sort of questions, and I've really summarized these in a very abstract way, but there's a lot of very specific and concrete questions that will be very, very dependent on your particular project and on your particular hardware and software needs. And having these sorts of questions, again, they can really factor into your sort of economic planning, as well as leading to more ethical behavior. So I'll stop with this summary there. We now want to have a final conversation of where are we going next with this white paper and this community. And I think Andrea was going to kick off this discussion, and this is also a point at which those of you watching, please feel free to ask questions, make suggestions, and so forth, and we can all respond as useful.
Sure. So just to kind of do the thing where we practice, where we preach, we thought it just would be useful to kind of show the underbelly and expose the structure of the paper early on to get feedback, so that we're not overlooking the things that we're trying to get people to ask important critical questions about. And that can be a very vulnerable feeling. But it is also really important when we're thinking about the goals of the paper and attempts to make the decision-making process as a whole more ethical in the long term. It's also important to demonstrate the benefits of transparency and to get comments and feedback along the way, so that what we do produce becomes something that's worthwhile for as many people as possible. So that's the stage where we are. We're really hoping that that sharing what it is at this stage, which actually has gone through multiple different versions to reach this kind of conclusion where we said, let's not overwhelm everyone, let's pare back a little bit, let's pull out the main points, and now let's get some feedback. That would be the most useful way to go forward. So as you're doing your exercise, and as you're also looking at the white paper, you'll see some areas more developed than others, but please contribute any case studies, any articles, any websites, resources that you find useful for thinking through some of the questions that we've posed. It will be sent out very shortly, or maybe it has already, Gabby, I'm struggling to remember, to a big group of people who expressed interest in wanting to be engaged. And these are people who registered for our initial online workshop, who came for the workshop that we held in London, It's also people who reached out directly and said, I'm sorry, I can't participate, because the level of interest that these events solicited was incredible. So we already had a really strong base of people to kind of draw from, even in terms of who registered, what their research was on, and that sort of thing. So the more that we all invest in this together, I think the better the outcome will be.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. Yes, and the RFC version of this document. So we're not calling it published. We're calling this a request for comments, which is at the link that I've just posted in the chat, and also there at the bottom of the screen. We don't expect you to be able to type it from the screen, but you can find the link on the next to you on the page. Has been sent out, yes, to that sort of the second circle, as it were, the second largest circle of people who expressed directly opted in to find information about this. It's not yet been sent out sort of to the community, to the world at large for comment, but anybody who saw that email, or anybody who's watching this video, or anybody who finds this via the SunoikisisDC program will have access to this, and we very much do want to get feedback from everybody in various ways. We're sort of assuming, it just occurs to me that that feedback at this stage will come via that mailing list. But since I guess there are a few people who are not on that mailing list who are now seeing this link and maybe therefore see this document, we probably ought to sort of have another option for giving us feedback. And I guess the most obvious option is to email us. I mean, if you're really interested in this, join the mailing list. I mean, there's a link to that in the PDF. But if you're not interested enough to join the mailing list, then email any one of us. I mean, Googling our names, I think, should find any one of us at our professional affiliations with the email addresses, and it would be great. You know, we really very much do want to get all sorts of feedback at a later stage, which you will again find out about via the mailing list or via various other venues. There will be a much more collaboratively editable version of this, which we're yet to decide exactly where that's going to live. Something like, but not necessarily technically exactly, a wiki will be something that people can also contribute to. And again, we hope the number of people who contribute to this will be orders of magnitude larger than this small group here who are sort of steering the first stage of it. So any thoughts about what sorts of feedback in particular we need from anybody? I'm noticing that I think most people watching this video will be watching it asynchronously, so we're not going to get a lot of feedback in the chat right here and now. So we probably need to give ourselves feedback for the moment. We could talk briefly. So SunoikisisDC is primarily a pedagogical and teaching resource, and so we're producing this session in the context of digital humanities and digital classics and digital cultural heritage teaching. So we could talk a little bit about the exercise that we've suggested for this, which anybody who's using this for self-learning is welcome to try out. Anyone who's one of my students is obliged to try out, and we will discuss it next week. But it's something that people can have a go at as a way to think through the model of this white paper, which is asking questions about your project and saying, have you thought about, and so forth. Would someone like to sort of quickly summarize how we structured that exercise?
Gabby, is that for us?
Yes. No, that's for us. That's for
Okay.
us. There's no one else.
Yeah, we thought that, the best way to test something in terms of its effectiveness is to apply it, right? So we thought that we would allow everyone to choose either a project that they had been working on or something that they had seen like in the news or really enjoyed and experienced themselves, and use that as like a prototype to kind of apply either a whole section or a very specific part and really ask, is this working? Is this question the right question? Is there a different question? Are there questions missing? Did I find this useful? What would I have done differently? Right? Those sorts of things. So it is just meant to really kind of guide that audit, right, of the project in a way that might result in changes. And you can pretend that you have all the money in the world if you want to. Like, let's be honest, most of the time, some of these decisions are made based on resource limitations. But the idea is that you undertake this project audit, and then you're able to see the utility of the white paper and think about what you would have changed, what would have remained the same, and what you thought was useful about the white paper in the process. And if there's an opportunity for feedback, please, please, please do suggest. That's exactly what this is here for. So.
Yeah, thank you. And again, if you're a student on this SunoikisisDC Digital Approaches to Cultural Heritage course, or on any other course that is using this as part of it, you may be thinking to yourself, I don't have a 3D project, but there are 3 other sessions on 3D topics in this semester. So we've had, as I said, we've had some photogrammetry and remote sensing a few weeks ago. We'll be doing some 3D modeling and reconstruction in a few weeks. There'll be some discussion of VR. Feel free to use those. There are all sorts of projects in the readings of those other sessions that you could take, and you could pretend that's your project and you're answering questions about that. So there's all sorts of ideas for ways to sort of explore these through projects that are not necessarily your own. It's a way to, as Andrea says, to interrogate your project using these questions, which in turn helps us to think about whether these are the right questions. For example, Paula, if someone was doing an EMKP case study, how would they address these questions to that?
Yeah, exactly. So from the communities that we work with and researchers, whenever a community member or member of the team wants to use 3D imaging methods and techniques, how would they go about it? What questions would they ask? Sometimes we all know that 3D is kind of a trendy kind of method or technology at the moment, and everybody wants to try it, which is amazing and it's really good, but it not always has to be 3D. Maybe you want to do a model with local materials, or you want to carve something, or you want to do it locally rather than using a 3D model and a 3D printer that then is gonna maybe use plastic to generate that new object, and the world doesn't necessarily need more plastic. So think about that, right? Like 3D methods are not always the best solution, and we're just helping people to consider whether it is the best for them, which it may be, and they make these sort of collections much more accessible. They allow you to have a kind of closer experience towards the materiality of the object, which you don't get necessarily with just a photo of the object itself. They really let you grasp the tangible aspect of the materials that you are working with. They allow you to zoom in and see aspects of the materials that you wouldn't see just with your naked eye. So they are amazing. They bring in a lot of possibilities, a lot of benefits to research and dissemination and engagement with younger generations as well, because they are really keen on trying them and work with them, especially for students, but they may not be the best solutions. So think about the impact, think about the environment, think about the community. They may not be wanting to digitize objects because they don't think they should be exposed to open access, or they shouldn't be shared in that way. So make sure that you are considering those voices, and that you are taking them into account in your project and making a space for and responding to them. So that's, I think, like we said, ethics are in between what you can do and what you should do. So we now have the tools, we now have the methods, and every day they are more extended because they are cheap. So it's really easy to get a camera with your phone and do a photogrammetry method. That's great, but we need to be careful. We need to be mindful of what we are doing, and we need to approach it ethically if we can. So yeah, and making these questions. And I think the idea of designing this document as a set of questions rather than a set of prescriptions or rules is the best, because it's just, we are asking the questions, we don't have the answers, we are just allowing you to think and approach your project in the best way possible, and considering all different aspects, possibilities and voices in that project. So yeah, that's why I think I got involved in the project from the very beginning, and I thought it was really, really interesting because in the program we facilitate research. We never prescript anything. We only facilitate. We always giving the full power to the team and the community to decide what they want to document and how. And so as facilitators, we also need to bring in the question of ethics and what's best in each case, and how to consider that aspect into the project from the very beginning and within the whole data cycle, like we were saying. So from data acquisition, processing, analysis, and then publication in the end, and the question of open access as well, and copyrights, like Tala was saying. So those are really key questions that we should take into account in any project using digital technologies and 3D specifically, but all the versions of 3D printing, 3D imaging, and all its versions, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And you also make a very good point that when we talk about 3D, we're sort of technology agnostic, right? We don't necessarily, just as we're not talking about any one particular aspect of 3D, we're not necessarily talking about high-tech 3D either. So, for example, we could apply some of these same questions to other kinds of work that don't necessarily even involve digitization or digital printing. The Senate House Makerspace, which is the room that we sat in for the second day of our workshop where we were planning this thing, it's a high-tech space. It's run by the Digital Humanities unit here at the University of London. It has 3 3D printers. It has some high-end computers. It has expensive cameras. It has all sorts of equipment specifically designed for 3D processing and other kinds of technology. But also, at the moment, once a fortnight, we're running an event in there which is called analog 3D printing, where we're using things like Play-Doh and clay and so forth, and getting our hands very dirty. And there are a lot of the same questions sort of arise. Where are we going to put this? How long is this going to take? Is this going to dry? Is this going to pollute the atmosphere? In this case, is there going to be clay smears all over the table when the next group are going to want to come in and do something else? Again, the same sorts of questions. How polluting are some of these materials we're using? Just because I'm making a copy of this piece of indigenous heritage using my hands rather than using a computer, does that take away some of the intellectual property issues or some of the indigenous empowerment issues that we've talked about? These questions, could be quite interesting to see these applied to other kinds of copying, other kinds of modeling, other kinds of reconstruction and visualization that aren't normally thought of as a sort of digital humanities practice.
So yeah, I would say basically, yeah, keep in mind these sections and think about them and think how you are going to incorporate them. And maybe you want to do a project assessment at the beginning, like Andrea was saying, considering the exercise, or maybe you want to do different project assessments, one related to each section. For example, environmental impact of your project. What is going to be the impact? How are you going to measure it? What measures you're going to put in place to try and mitigate that impact? Because there is going to be an impact. There is always an impact in the hard drives you buy, the technology, the equipment, the cameras, the storage of the data. So just keep that in mind, consider it, and see and think about ways to mitigate it. In fact, like for example, traveling as well. If you are traveling to the other side of the world to carry out that project, that's gonna take, it's gonna generate a lot of carbon footprint. So how can you reduce that? And maybe it doesn't have to be you traveling to do it, but you can actually build capacity in country and find collaborators there that can do that work for you. That would be even nicer, because then you can build those networks and you can start collaborating with the community there, or research or local researchers there that can carry out that project for you. You can train them online and have like build capacity in country. That's always really interesting. Something we promote from the MPP a lot in terms of like expanding the networks and collaborations, and have a collaborative approach from the beginning as well. Like what I was saying in terms of multivocality and allowing different voices to come in and have a say, and don't assume that there is only one person representing a whole community, because that's hardly the case. There may be different people that want to have a word, and sometimes they have different perspectives on what should be done. So you need to make sure that they can participate. So in a documentation project like this that uses technology in our perspective.
Great, thank you very much, Paula. So we're about out of time. Does anyone else have any final comments before we go? In which case, thank you again all very much. And thank you for watching, the viewers, and please join us next week when we'll have a session on using Wikidata and other wiki tools in research. So thank you very much. Bye.